Good evening, everyone. My name is Dennis Stone, and I'm the director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Jacksonville Urban League. And with me tonight is Victoria Jack, one of our interns in our program, and she will be introducing Abel Bartley, our guest for this evening. He is doing a repeat performance. He did so well in a previous presentation that we invited him back. So without further, I'm going to turn it over to Victoria.
All right, thank you, Dennis. So this is Dr. Abel A. Bartley, who is a Jacksonville native and professor of African American and urban history at Clemson University. He earned his PhD from Florida State University in 1994, specializing in African American and urban history. A returning speaker in the Racial Healing and Reconciliation series, Dr. Bartley brings insight into school integration, race relations, and the ongoing struggle for equity in Jacksonville and beyond. He is the author of 3 books, including Keeping the Faith, Race Politics, and Social Development in Jacksonville, Florida, Akron's Black Heritage, and In No Ways Tired, the NAACP's struggle to integrate the Duval County Public Schools. In 2009, he published a chapter in Thomas Green Clemson and 2 chapters in Old South, New South, or Down South, Florida, and the Modern Civil Rights Movement in 2010. He has also published more than 18 articles on African American politics, history, culture, and civil rights, and has presented at more than 45 academic conferences. Dr. Bartley previously served as a director of the Pan-African Center for Community Studies at the University of Akron, and later created the Pan-African Studies program at Clemson University. Currently, he is professor of African American and Urban History at Clemson University, and immediate past president of the South Conference on African American Studies Incorporated. Thank you for being with us here today, Dr. Bartley, and the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Tonight, I'm just going to spend a few moments again talking a little bit about civil rights in Jacksonville, doing a little background information. We are, first I'm going to do a little get on the soapbox for a few minutes, and then I'll get off the soapbox. But we are living in some really strange time. In our effort to erase history, or not erase history, we're erasing history. There has been an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And like several people have asked, we're trying to figure out which of those words, diversity, equity, or inclusion, that is so offensive to so many people. But it's important, I think, very much so important, that we know all the pieces that made up this quilt that we call the United States. And I think it's very important that people in Jacksonville know all the parts that made up the quilt of Jacksonville's history also. And I think that if we denigrate any part of that history, we're not actually telling the truth of what happened. And so one of the things I would like to do is fill in a few of the blanks and talk about some of the things and some of the people that have helped make the United States what it is, who have a heritage that is connected to Jacksonville. Some of that we talked about before, but others I just want to remind people of. And, when you think about Florida coming into the Union 1820s, small state, almost half the state was basically unusable. There were similar tribes in the southern part, and and now we got Alcatraz, alligator Alcatraz. But back then there was no one down there, and so North Florida sort of became a central place. The Tallahassee to Jacksonville to Pensacola area became the area of development. And for Jacksonville played an outsized role in Florida's development because of its position along the coast, and also because of the St. Johns River. As we began to engage in the slave trade, African Americans became more and more important. And then particularly as we moved towards the Civil War, African American soldiers, the Union occupied Jacksonville twice during the Civil War. And those African American soldiers who came to Jacksonville found a place that was, with the climate, it was very nice. It was a place where there was a lot of land. There was a lot of opportunity with the river and other things. And so you it became a place where African Americans began to congregate right after the Civil War. And a lot of those soldiers who had participated in the Civil War remained in Jacksonville. And one of the things that people don't really understand or really don't know is one of the greatest educators of African Americans, when slavery ended, about 80% of African Americans were illiterate. They could not read or write. And some people say it was as high as 90%. But one of the big areas where you did have a dramatic increase in literacy were soldiers. And so those soldiers who participated in the Civil War, African American soldiers, they had the advantage of learning how to read and write. And so you had, from the beginning, you had a somewhat educated foundation for Jacksonville that other communities did not have. And I think it gave Jacksonville an advantage because when they began to introduce leadership into the city, that a lot of those former soldiers became part of the leadership, and they were able to lend their intellectual ability and their leadership skills to helping Jacksonville, helping the African American community develop. And once the Civil War ended and we began the difficult process of trying to integrate African Americans into American society, one of the things that I find so intriguing, particularly as you look at what's going on today, I often ask my class, and I've been teaching now for almost 40 years, and I can't hardly believe I must have started when I was 2. But I ask my class, and almost no one gets it right. How did you become a citizen of the United States before the 14th Amendment? And almost no one knows. And it's been something that has been really intriguing for a lot of people because, I say, you were born in America, you don't know how you became a citizen before the Civil War, and no one really knows. And the reality of it is, before the 14th Amendment, the way you got citizenship in the United States was you got citizenship in the state that you resided in. And if you were a citizen of that state, you then became a citizen of the United States. And most people don't know that. Now, when the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States was faced with a very important decision. What do you do with the nearly 4 million African Americans who are now part of the United States? And I always tell my class, they basically had 3 choices. You could return them to slavery, and there were some people who thought about that. You could create a second-class status for African Americans, and there were a lot of people who talked about that. Or you could make them full-fledged citizens of the United States. And there was a lot of debate about what to do. And the choice that they made was they decided to make African Americans full-fledged citizens of the United States. And the question is, how do you make African Americans into full-fledged citizens of the United States? That became the question. How do you do it? And I'm going to give you all a little background information that my students pay a lot of money for, but I'm giving you all free tonight. And if you want to read a little bit more on it, I wrote an article some years ago in the Akron Law Review called The 14th Amendment, the Great Equalizer of the American People. And that's where I'm going to spend a little time tonight on this whole notion of 14th Amendment, and then we'll move into some other things. But when slavery ended, they have these 3 choices. What are you going to do with African Americans? In 1865, as they were trying to figure out what to do with African Americans, the notion of citizenship was an evolving idea. What does it mean to be a citizenship? To be a citizen of the United States? Because citizenship implies that you have all of the rights, privileges, and immunities that come along with citizenship. Those 3 words are important: rights, privileges, and immunities. Those 3 things come with citizenship. So the question is, there was only one group in America at that time that had all the rights, privileges, and immunities. That was white men. And so the question is, how do you transform African Americans into citizens? Now, they had 2 choices. You could either level down the rights of whites and make whites black, or you could level up the rights of African Americans and legally turned African Americans into white men. Now, I want to back up for a second because it's important you understand something. Before the Civil War ended, the vast majority of African Americans in the United States were slaves. They weren't just slaves, but they were what we called chattel slaves. And the word chattel means property. And so they were not defined as human beings, they were defined as property. And so the question is, how do you turn property into people? And that became the question when John Bingham, the author of the 14th Amendment, when he was sitting around trying to figure out, how do I do this? How do I legally do this? How do I legally turn these African Americans into citizens? That became the question. And so what he said is, we're going to create basically a color-blind society. Now, I want y'all to understand what he was talking about. When he said colorblind society, he wasn't saying that we weren't going to see color. In essence, what he was saying was, instead of we're not going to see color, we are going to see color. With the 14th Amendment, he legally transformed property into white men. If you've ever read the 14th Amendment, that's one of the things I have my little constitution here. If you've ever read the 14th Amendment, and I make my classes do this now because I think it is just so incredible. If you've ever read the 14th Amendment, the way it is written is really impressive because what it does is it is dealing with a very perplexing question, and that is the question of, how do I turn this property into men or into citizens? And I want to just read to you for a few moments what the 14th Amendment says. And I want to do this because I want to make sure y'all understand what it says. The 14th Amendment says, well, first I want to go back. All right, I want to go back because I got a little excited. First, you got to start with the 13th Amendment. When the Civil War ended, African Americans were legally non-persons. They didn't exist legally. There was no definition for them because we ratified the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. I mean, in February of 1865. But what did that mean? It just simply ended the fact that African Americans were property, but it did not turn them into people. And that became the problem then. Who are African Americans? Because legally they had no definition. There is a African American historian / philosopher by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote a very incredible book called Black Reconstruction in the South. And in this book, he does a very great job of trying to explain that with the 13th Amendment, all it did was free African Americans, but they had no legal status in the United States. And so when John Bingham is trying to figure out how do we turn this property give it some legal status, he and the people who worked with him creating the 14th Amendment, they spent a lot of time trying to figure out how you do this. One of the things that they found out is because African Americans did not have any legal status, the South said African Americans were basically the same people they were before the Civil War. That is, they had the same status of free blacks before the Civil War. If you know anything about U.S. history, before 1865, free blacks in the state of Florida, they were there, but they had no legal protection and no legal rights. And so when the Civil War ended, Florida said, okay, the slaves they're no longer slaves, but they're not citizens. They have the same status of free blacks. Well, then you need to go back and look at what the status of free blacks are. Well, you don't have to do a lot of hard work to figure that out because Florida told you what that status was, because they wrote a series of laws called Black Codes. And those Black Codes outlined the status that free blacks had in the United States before the Civil War. Now, how do I know that? Well, the reason I know that is because they said it. they didn't have to write those codes down before the Civil War because they governed it and everyone knew that those were their laws. Once the Civil War ended, because now there was no longer slavery, we now have to redefine the etiquette between African Americans and whites. And that etiquette was based upon the same rules that existed before the Civil War. And so you get these black codes. Now, those black codes basically said that African Americans were not citizens of the state, and they did not have the legal status or the legal rights of most people in the state of Florida or whatever state they resided in. And so you couldn't own property, you couldn't carry weapons, you couldn't do certain things. You basically were just a little higher in status than you were as a slave. And so African Americans immediately began to challenge this status. And so in 1868, John Bingham and the people who were working with him, and they began in 1866. 1866, we passed the Civil Rights Act, which then attempts to give African Americans legal status in the South. The president of the United States at the time was a man by the name of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was probably the worst person to be president of the United States in 1866. And he should never have been president of the United States in 1866. When Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson as his vice president in 1864, Lincoln had no idea that he was going to go to the theater and watch Hamilton. I mean, not Hamilton, my American Cousin, and that John Wilkes Booth, an actor, was going to shoot him. But he was trying to show that he had no real angst against the South. And so what he did was he chose the only Southern senator who did not give up his seat and leave the Union when the Civil War began, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson came to the White House. He had just learned how to read and write. His wife had just taught him. When he takes over as president, right after Lincoln is murdered, he decides to use a version of Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan, which basically quickly brought the South back into the Union. And all it said was that when 20% of Southerners who had voted in the 1860 election were able to take an oath to the federal government that they had not participated in the Civil War and that they took an oath of loyalty to the United States government, they would be back in the Union. And he found out immediately that that did not work. So what he does is, by 1866, Congress takes over and they say, we're going to determine the status of African Americans. And they write a Civil Rights Act, which gave African Americans equality with whites and did some other things. And one of the things that it did is, how many of y'all have ever heard the term 40 acres and a mule? Yeah, okay, that term, 40 acres and a mule, a lot of African Americans talk about the 40 acres and a mule. Well, in 1866, in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it provided 40 acres to African Americans who had participated in slavery as compensation for their years as slaves. This measure passed in the Senate and it passed in the House, and it got to President Johnson's desk. And instead of President Johnson signing it, he vetoed it. Not only did he veto it, then he talked about the people who passed that legislation, that they were disloyal and that they did not deserve to be called loyal citizens of the United States. Well, a few months later, Congress got together and they overrode his veto. But to get this veto overridden, they had to take out that provision for the 40 acres and a mule. And so even though they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, they took out a very important piece of it, that 40 acres and a mule. And that's the part African Americans are still talking about. They didn't get their 40 acres and a mule. It was passed, but the president of the United States had decided that he would veto the bill, and so African Americans did not get it. Now, going back to what I want to get to. So we get the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It gives African Americans equal rights. It makes them temporary citizens in the United States. But John Bingham recognizes that the South still has a lot of angst towards African Americans, and they're not going to recognize that citizenship. And so what John Bingham does is he says we need to change the Constitution and embed citizenship into the Constitution so that people will know exactly what is required to be a citizen of the United States. And so he creates the 14th Amendment, working with several other people. He writes the 14th Amendment. And I want to read to you all just a few lines of what the 14th Amendment says. The 14th Amendment says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the states in which they reside. Now, let me explain why he wrote it that way. Initially, you got citizenship by being born or being given citizenship in the state you lived in. So if I was born in Florida, which I was, then I would be a citizen of the state of Florida, and then I would be a citizen of the United States. In 1865, John Bingham recognized that there was almost no chance that the state of Florida was going to give someone like me citizenship. Neither was the state of Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana. Those states were not going to give citizenship to African Americans. So he said they took this notion of citizenship out of the hands of the states and they put citizenship in the hands of the federal government. That's why they said if you are born or naturalized in the United States or any territory that the United States claimed, you now are a citizen of the United States. So now your citizenship does not come from your state, it comes from the federal government. But this is the powerful thing that it does, the second part, because people ignore the second part. The second part says, and of the state wherein you reside. That means that if I'm born in the state of Florida, the state of Florida can't determine my citizenship. The fact that I was born in Florida and Florida is part of the United States, I'm automatically a citizen of the United States, which then automatically makes me a citizen of the state of Florida. Do you all understand what I'm saying? So that is what the federal government was doing with the 14th Amendment, because what John Bingham recognized is there was no way in the world that African Americans would ever get citizenship if it was up to the states, because the southern states were never going to award citizenship to African Americans. And not only do they give African Americans citizenship, they give them all the rights, privileges, and immunities that come along with citizenship. Now, I want you to understand one other thing they do, because this is a setup to the civil rights movement that I'm going to talk about in a few seconds. The second part of that citizenship says, the other part of it says, is that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, meaning that the state cannot take away your American citizenship rights. In essence, what it did was it elevated African Americans to full status of citizen in the United States. A very powerful thing. So as of 1868, African Americans had full equality. They were considered in the law as white men. So when you walked into a court, the courts would see you as a white man and give you the same justice that they would get. All the rights, privileges, and immunities that went along with citizenship. Well, they noticed something that was missing. States were beginning to recognize this dilemma, and they began to assault some of those rights and privileges, mainly the voting rights. And so the states began to pass laws which restricted the voting rights of some of their citizens. So again, Congress steps in with the 15th Amendment. And what the 15th Amendment simply says is, if a state takes away the voting rights of any group of citizens, then that state will lose representation based on the percentage of those citizens that they've taken the voting rights away. Now, in much of the South, places like South Carolina, where I live now, and Mississippi, African Americans made up half of the state. So if Mississippi or South Carolina took the voting rights from African Americans, they would lose half of their representation in Congress. It was a very powerful piece of legislation. The problem is the United States has never really enforced the 15th Amendment. So what happens? African Americans get full citizenship rights. They get legal protection for their voting rights. Almost immediately, Southerners come together to try and undermine that citizenship. First, they began to pass a series of laws which are designed to challenge how much protection do you actually have as a citizen in the United States. What does it mean that the state cannot discriminate against its citizens? And that became the question. And so we have a simple case that occurs in the state of Louisiana that does not involve color, does not involve race at all. In the state of Louisiana, there were a bunch of men, a bunch of people who opened butcher shops in Louisiana, and they began to slaughter hogs, cows, and other stuff. And there was no regulation of those butcher shops. And so the state of Louisiana passed a law saying that they would give licenses and they would pick which butchers would be allowed to have license in the state of Louisiana. Simple law. Well, the butchers who did not get license, they sued the state of Louisiana, arguing that by picking butchers and giving them license and not giving license to other butchers, the state was discriminating against certain citizens and violating the 14th Amendment. So the case goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Now, the state made the argument that we have to regulate butchers to maintain the public health and security for the state of Louisiana. And the United States Supreme, the justices on the United States Supreme Court agreed with them that if it's for public health and safety, the state can discriminate if it is in adherence and in forwarding public health and safety. Had nothing to do with race. Okay, so all they're saying is that if it's something that's for public health and safety, the state can discriminate. That's all the state needed to hear. So they began to slowly begin to challenge, what if we began to discriminate based on race? And so in the state of Louisiana, the same state where they had that butcher case, they, on their trains, the local trains that carried citizens, they put a star on certain trains, and they made a law that African Americans had to ride on the trains that had the stars, and they could not ride on the other trains. And so they began to enforce that law. The African Americans had to ride on the star train. Now, African Americans, of course, challenged that. And initially, the court said, okay, that's taken a little farther. Other states began to do the same thing. They began to pass laws which restricted the citizenship of African Americans. African Americans were not allowed to ride in first-class cars, mainly because first-class cars were where upper-class whites lived, work, or traveled, and they said, we don't want to associate with African Americans. And so states began to pass these laws challenging whether or not a state had the ability to discriminate against its citizens. And these cases all come to a head in 1883 when Congress passed, in 1875, Congress passed the new Civil Rights Act, which basically totally outlawed discrimination against groups, against races. And states began to challenge it all over the United States, in the North, the South, everywhere. And so African Americans challenged it. And in 1883, the United States Supreme Court said, the 14th Amendment protects you from state-sponsored discrimination, but it does not protect you from individual private discrimination. That is, if a person owns a store or owns a hotel or owns a restaurant, that person has a right to discriminate and keep customers out who they don't want in. And so it allowed the South to begin the process of discriminating against African Americans. And that's where you first get segregation established. Now, that segregation is what we call de facto, by fact, not so much by law. Later, states began to pass laws which discriminated against African Americans, challenging whether or not a state could then discriminate against its citizens. And so in the state of Louisiana, I'm skipping some other things, state of Louisiana passed a law that said African Americans had to ride in separate trains when traveling through the state of Louisiana. These trains that they had for African Americans were not first-class trains. They were just trains. African Americans could not ride in first-class trains in Louisiana. Now, Louisiana was a strange state. And I'm telling you why. In Louisiana, they had a different racial hierarchy than any other state. In Louisiana in 1811, there had been a slave rebellion. The largest slave rebellion in American history occurred in New Orleans in 1811. And the slaves almost were successful. There were some slaves that had come from Haiti. They were in Louisiana. Louisiana was a French territory at the time. And they organized a slave rebellion. And they came close to winning. You had the slaves, you had the slave owners, but the group in the middle were a group of people called Creoles. They were mixed race. And whoever they supported during that slave rebellion, that side was going to win in that slave rebellion. And in 1811, the Creoles chose to support the owners. And they helped put down the slave rebellion in New Orleans in 1811. As a result, the state of Louisiana created special designation, a special status for Creoles, whereby they were not viewed as Black, but as Creoles, and they were given certain privileges and immunities that Blacks could not receive. After the Civil War, when the United States began to harden racial lines, the United States developed a racial policy that no other place in the world developed. We developed what was called the one-drop rule. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but the one-drop rule was a rule that was used in the United States, which said that if you had one drop of African blood in you, you then were considered African American or Black. So, for Creoles now, that means that for the first time, the state of Louisiana is now defining them as Blacks. And the restrictions that they put on African Americans are now placed on Creoles. And so the Creoles challenge the status. And they pick a Creole, a man by the name of Homer Plessy, who is 1/8 Black. He's an octoroon. He gets on a train. He sits in the first class section where whites are. The conductor comes by, they punch his ticket, and they move on. Most people, he is so light-skinned that people thought he was white. When the conductor comes back through to punch his ticket for the second leg of the trip, he informs the conductor that I'm a black person sitting in the white section. And so the conductor has him arrested and he sues. And the case goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court, in a very strange decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, they rule 8-1 that the state can discriminate against black citizens as long as they create a new term, separate but equal accommodations. And so the state gets the legal right to discriminate against African Americans as long as it's separation and not subjugation. All right, 3 years later, state of Georgia, there is a woman by the name of Lucy Craft Laney who opens a high school in Cummings County, Georgia, little town called Cummings, Georgia. She opens a high school for African Americans. There is another high school in the city for whites. The city meets, school board meets, and they said, look, we can't afford 2 high schools. So we need to close one of these 2 high schools. Even though Lucy Craft Laney's high school is larger, it's been there longer, it has more students, they vote to close her high school and keep the white high school open. She sues, and the case goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And what she argues, what her lawyers argue is, if you're going to follow the mandate of Plessy v. Ferguson, since you closed our high school and African Americans in Cummings cannot get a high school education, you then need to close the white high school. Because if black students can't get an education, white students should not be able to get an education. That was her lawyer's argument. And the Supreme Court ruled in a 9-1 decision that when it came to the question of separate or equal, separate was more important than equal. And so they kept the white high school open and they closed Laney's High School. And so from 1899, Cummings v. Georgia, for the South then, they recognized that they could separate African Americans and they don't have to provide them equal accommodations. And that's where you get the foundation of this unequal society and African Americans having second-class status in the United States. And so from 1899 onward, African Americans now began the fight of trying to get back their citizenship rights and their equality. And so they began to try a number of techniques and tactics trying to get citizenship right. And so you see a series of African American actions that are designed to try and get citizenship rights back. In the early part of the 20th century, as cities began to expand in the South, African Americans began to fight for access to public accommodations. And if you know anything about Jacksonville's history, during the 1920s, African Americans held boycotts and sit-ins on local public transportation systems, trying to end segregation on local public transportation systems in the 1920s. There was a vast movement in the 1920s of African Americans, particularly right after the World War I, as they were trying to regain their citizenship rights. Now, what was going on? During World War I, after World War I, African Americans come back from World War I. 365,000 African American men fought during World War I. And they fought with the promise that the war was a war to make the world safe for democracy. That if they went across the seas and fought and won the war, that they would get democracy like everyone else was expecting democracy who fought during World War I. And so these African American soldiers come back and they're expecting democracy from the United States, But instead, the United States has moved, and it's actually even worse as far as race relations are concerned than they were before the war. There's a new group that is founded. It's not a new group, it's an old group that was reestablished during this period called the Ku Klux Klan. On Thanksgiving Day, 1915, in the town of Atlanta, a man by the name of William J. Simmons, he's a Methodist minister. He had been doing a series of religious meetings. And at the end of the meeting, he talked about, we need to bring America back. We need to restore morality and all stuff back to the United States. And we need an organization that does that. And so what he does is he gets a group of men. They go to Stone Mountain in Georgia. They douse a cross with gasoline. They stick it in the ground. They set it on fire, and they reestablish the Ku Klux Klan. That's on Thanksgiving Day, 1915. The Klan grows slowly, but during World War II, with the immigration and all of the radicalism, and particularly after the fall of of Russia, Tsarist Russia, the Klan takes off as a reactionary group, and they began to try to take rights and reduce rights for African Americans. At the same time, these African American soldiers are returning from World War I, and they have all these ideas about these promises that they were going to get from fighting in the war. And they form what they call the New Negro Movement. It is the New Negro Movement which feeds the Harlem Renaissance. These African Americans are demanding that their sacrifice be rewarded. And so what you have is the summer of 1919, which is called the Red Summer, because during the summer of 1919, more than 25 American cities explode in rioting as African Americans are fighting for their citizenship rights. The term Red Summer comes from the head of the NAACP. And at the time in 1919, the head of the NAACP was a man from Jacksonville who had moved to New York. Someone who some of you may or may not know, a man by the name of James Weldon Johnson. James Weldon Johnson was from Jacksonville, Florida, grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. He graduated from Stanton High School, where his mother was the principal. He comes back, he leaves Stanton, he goes to Atlanta University, then he goes to Columbia, where he gets a master's degree, and he comes back to Jacksonville. He takes over as the principal of Stanton in Jacksonville. At the time, Stanton only went up to 8 grades. That's what most Black schools went up to at that time. And he transformed Stanton from a school that has 8 grades to a school that has 11 grades. And he makes Stanton the first African-American high school in the state of Florida. He serves as principal at Stanton, and he now has Stanton as a high school. Now, one of the things he decides to do, he decides also to read law and become a lawyer. At the time, no African American had ever passed the Florida bar. So he works with another lawyer, he reads law, and he takes the Florida bar. And he shocks everybody because he passes the Florida bar, becoming the first African American to pass the Florida bar. Some of you may or may not know that in the early part of the century, Jacksonville had a major fire, and most of downtown Jacksonville burned down. Well, James Weldon Johnson and his brother, Rosamond Johnson, he has a brother named Rosamond. Rosamond is a very talented musician. He's a pianist, jazz pianist, very talented guy. And so Johnson works with his brother, and they form an entertainment group that travels the United States. In the early part of the century, 1905, Booker T. Washington, who is the president of Tuskegee Institute, but he's also the leading spokesman for African Americans, he takes a tour of southern states and southern cities to demonstrate how much progress African Americans have made. And one of the things he does is he visits the city of Jacksonville. Now, just before he comes, there's a riot in Jacksonville, and an African American is beaten up, and there's some things that happen. But he comes to Jacksonville, and one of the things he does is he visits Stanton, and he meets James Weldon Johnson. And James Weldon Johnson wants to celebrate Booker Washington visiting Jacksonville. And so he writes a poem entitled Lift Every Voice and Sing. James Weldon Johnson's brother, Rosamond, takes the poem, and he makes it into lyrics for a song. And James Weldon Johnson teaches it to his students at Stanton. And they sing that song for Booker T. Washington at Stanton High School when Booker Washington visits Jacksonville. The song has such a catchy tune that as Booker Washington leaves, other people who are there hear the song, and they begin to take the song outside of Jacksonville to other parts of the United States. And eventually that song is adopted as the African American anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And you hear it during Black History Month. That's where it started. It started at Stanton High School with James Weldon Johnson singing the song for Booker T. Washington when he visited Jacksonville as part of his educational tour. Now, another student who had been educated in Jacksonville, a man by the name of Asa Philip Randolph. He also is living in Jacksonville during the early part of the 20th century. His father is a minister. He's educated in Jacksonville, and he leaves Jacksonville and he goes to New York. He then becomes active in helping organize labor unions in New York. And he works with one of the most powerful group of Black workers, sleeping car porters and maids. They're a group of African Americans who work on the trains called porters. They work for a man by the name of George Pullman. Pullman owns the sleeping cars and the dining cars that the railroads use to ferry people. And the workers on there are African American workers. And so he organizes them into a union. And this union becomes the most powerful union in the United States. And it's made up of these Black workers. And he's able to get them recognized by the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations. And it becomes one of the first recognized Black unions in the United States. It gives him tremendous power. And so he is constantly pushing to improve conditions for African Americans. So by 1941, it is clear that the United States is probably going to participate in World War II. The federal government wants to continue to discriminate against African Americans, even though they will need African Americans to win the war. And so A. Philip Randolph organizes a March on Washington to protest discrimination against African Americans, particularly in the war industries, where you have these great jobs that pay a lot of money, but these companies are discriminating against African Americans. So he organizes a March on Washington where he threatens to bring 100,000 African Americans to Washington, D.C. to protest discrimination. President Roosevelt is frightened that the Germans and the rest of the world will think that the United States is divided. And so he begs A. Philip Randolph not to do that. A. Philip Randolph will not back down. And so eventually, President Roosevelt decides to placate A. Philip Randolph, and he signs the second most important executive order ever signed by a president in reference to African Americans, and that is Executive Order 8802, which ends discrimination against African Americans in war industry. It opens up African Americans to some of the higher paying jobs in the war industry. And it makes A. Philip Randolph a national hero. When the war ended, A. Philip Randolph is angry that the United States still is segregating its military. And so he threatens to organize a boycott of African Americans of the military if the military does not integrate. The president of the United States, Harry Truman, resists, but because he is so powerful and it looks like he's going to be able to do it, President Harry Truman relents and he signs an executive order which integrated the military in 1948. So A. Philip Randolph now has gotten African Americans jobs in war industry, and he also got African Americans integrated into all branches of the military. Later in 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Civil Rights Bill. This Civil Rights Bill would end discrimination and outlaw segregation in the United States. Again, A. Philip Randolph organizes a march on Washington to pressure Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill. And he threatens to bring 100,000 African Americans to Washington, D.C. to pressure Congress to sign the Civil Rights Bill. More than 200,000 people go to Washington, D.C., and it is there in September of 1963 that Dr. Martin Luther King gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But what most people don't know is that entire day was orchestrated and organized by A. Philip Randolph, another person from Jacksonville, Florida. Now, I talked to a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance. I know I'm running out of time. But the Harlem Renaissance was a period where African Americans demonstrated their intellectual and academic prowess. One of the most important figures of the Harlem Renaissance was an African American woman who inspired generations of African American female writers, a woman by the name of Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was born in Alabama, but raised in the little town of Eatonville, Florida, which is just outside of Orlando. When she was about 13 years old, her and her stepmother had a confrontation, and so she was thrown out of the home, and she moved to Jacksonville. And while in Jacksonville, she was educated. And while in Jacksonville, she was introduced to one of the world's great anthropologists, a man by the name of Franz Boas. Franz Boas convinced her to do interviews with African Americans in the Caribbean and former slaves and collect their stories. She then, during the 1920s, began to write articles and books based upon those stories that she had collected while working for Franz Boas. And so she is one of the most influential figures of the Harlem Renaissance. And she becomes the person who inspires people, other African American writers during the last part of the 20th century. The Color Purple, all those other books that come out during the Civil Rights Movement, those African American female writers are inspired by Zora Neale Hurston. Again, you trace it back to African Americans and the fact that in Jacksonville, you have this high school which is educating these African Americans, and they're going out and doing all this great stuff. And so African Americans in Jacksonville play an outside role in America's civil rights movement. And it's hard to think, the only reason that the NAACP came south was because James Weldon Johnson, when he took over as director of the NAACP, said, we have to be where the fight is. And so he opened up NAACP offices in the South where they began to fight for civil rights. And so James Weldon Johnson is responsible for the work that the NAACP did in the South in integrating the South. He was the person who was the leader when the NAACP got its legal defense fund, which was run by a man by the name of Charles Hamilton Houston, that filed all those lawsuits that ended discrimination. So I've done a sort of around the way lecture that sort of ties Jacksonville to the civil rights movement and the significance of Jacksonville to the civil rights movement. And when you talk about other figures during the civil rights movement, people like Earl Johnson, who was responsible, who was the first African American to become president of the city council in the city of Jacksonville. He was the guy responsible for helping get city council, what we call consolidation of the city and the county, making Jacksonville the largest city in the United States. People like Rutledge Pearson, who led the Florida branch of the NAACP during the 1960s. He was the one who helped integrate Florida. People like Ernest Jackson, people like there's so many others. Mary Singleton, and Sally Mathis, two of the first African Americans elected to city council in the South. There were two females from Jacksonville. So my point is, Jackson played an outside role in the civil rights movement, and to erase that history is to erase history and not tell the full story. And so that's just what I want you all to know tonight. And I'll open it up for questions. I talked for about an hour. I know that I could go on and on, but I know you probably have other things to do. So I'll open up the questions. If you have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to add, we've been here for an hour now. So I'm assuming that's about what y'all want me to do, Dr. Stone and Victoria.
I have a question. I know earlier you talked about the kind of the big blowout between the slaves and the slave owners, and then there was the Creoles. I'm sorry if I missed it, but was there a reason that the Creoles chose the slave owners side?
Yes, there is. If you've ever studied or gone to New Orleans or gone to Louisiana and seen the role that the Creoles played, the way the French ran Haiti was, in fact, the most brutal form of slavery was in Haiti. And that's why when the Haitians revolted, it was they tried to kill off all the whites and did all the stuff they did. But the way the French ran Haiti was, they had a group of Africans who they had intermingled with, who they then made the leaders and used them to sort of oversee and make sure the system worked as spies and other stuff. And so when the Haitian Revolution ended, a lot of them came to Louisiana, and they worked in the same, and they set up a similar situation where they used those Creoles to spy on and help coordinate or run the system of slavery, keep them in charge. And that's why they chose to work with their people that they had been working with before. And they had, relations with them and all that other stuff. They were considered part of their family.
Gotcha.
Have you ever been to New Orleans and seen the role Creoles play?
No, but I do want to go to New Orleans. But also,
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if it was because they knew that they would get something out of it or something, but that makes sense that they had kind of
And they did
relationship.
get something out of it. They got better treatment.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
You were talking about the 14th Amendment earlier, and I wanted to know what you thought about the executive order on the 14th Amendment, if you've read about it, because there's that kind of argumentation of it was originally intended for the civil rights movement, not for, immigrant families that it's being applied to now. And I'm wondering if you think that has grounding, if that's going to be taken seriously, that kind of argumentation.
No, I don't. And it was originally set up to so it was the only way really that they could get African American citizenship. But it applied to the fact that if you were born in the United States, you became a citizen of the United States. What the whole point of the 14th Amendment was to take the power of the state to determine citizenship and put it in the hands of the federal government, so that you had one rule that determined who was a citizen. if you follow the logic of our president now, it would go back to the states, and they could then determine who becomes citizen and who can't. And that violates the whole principle of the 14th Amendment and citizenship. And it violates the principle of equal protection before the law. And it's ironic that our president's wife got citizenship through naturalization. It just doesn't make any sense. And it's clearly claimed that aimed at brown people and black people, because you didn't give citizenship to white South Africans who come to the United States. It makes no sense. Any other questions or comments?
What do you think is the area that will be the biggest stumbling block for the current administration at the federal level in terms of their strategy for moving back the clock on civil rights?
Normally, I would say the courts. No, that's it. But what I really think is going to happen is rights are like air. You don't miss them until they're gone. And I think that once people wake up and recognize the assault on their rights, that there's going to be a backlash. History swings on a pendulum. We swing very far this way in the 1920s. You saw that. Then you swing back. Then you swing. I think we're now at one of those reflection moments where the pendulum has swung very far to the right. But the history of the United States there is a correction. And I think that, you see what happened in New York City with the election of with the Democratic nominee for mayor. People are beginning to recognize they don't want to lose those rights. It always seems cool taking rights from someone else. It's just when those rights are taken from you. And I think people are going to recognize that they're losing those rights, and there's going to be a reaction. The president has never passed about 44% approval rating. He is ruled from a small, very vocal minority. And I think that when the other people recognize that they have power, I'm very interested to see with the 2026 election where the country goes, because I don't think that most people are comfortable with the direction that with the road we're on right now. Our economy is not doing all that well, and people are losing rights. And so it's going to be interesting to see. So I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a backlash. Jingoism only works so long.
Yeah.
And then you have to, as they say, people can't eat jingoism. And as the economy gets bad and there's things that go wrong, I think people are going to wake up and there's going to be a correction, a course correction. At least that's what I'm hoping.
Yeah. Well, we always promise people will end at 8 o'clock.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Otherwise, they won't come. It's kind of like going to church and having church go on too long. You lose your congregation. So we really appreciate your words. And Victoria, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking with us today. It was all very informative and very interesting to kind of fill in the blanks on, what we learn usually in history class. So thank you again and have a great night, everyone.
Thank y'all for inviting me.
I do also want to add thanks to the interns that have worked to get you back, and the series of town halls we're having this summer. They've been really working hard on those. Next week we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night. We have each night a town hall. The first 2 nights it's on the career of law for Monday and Tuesday, and then Wednesday and Thursday are covering the maternal health challenges in Jacksonville and generally in the United States. And also Thursday will be focus on the immigration problems that have been created and what the impact on Jacksonville is.
Oh, well.
So we look forward to having all of you back with us. Spread the word to others, and please, Professor Bartley, if you can attend any of those, we're happy to have you as a commentator.
All right. Thank y'all again for
Have a
inviting
great
me.
evening, everyone.
Thank you.